Good evening, everyone. Good morning. Ohayo gozaimasu to friends and colleagues in Japan and the rest of Asia. I'm Yves Tiberghien, Professor of Political Science and Co-Director of the Center for Japanese Research at UBC. Welcome to the webinar on 10 years after Fukushima, commemoration and lessons for the future. We're truly thrilled and honored today to have a dream lineup with some of the best experts and scholars on the topic. This event is jointly organized by the University of Tokyo Graduate School of Public Policy and the Institute for Future Initiatives, as well as the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and Center of Japanese Research at UBC. This is part of a long partnership between our two schools, and it builds on past events that we've done together on risk management. Before going further, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, as well as the Wasaneg people, who have called this area home for many thousands of years and continue to do so today. Since we're on a virtual platform, I'd like to invite you to reflect upon the indigenous lands that you are on today as well. A good online resource to do so is called Native Land, http://native-land.ca. The first people of the Pacific Northwest here share ancient human and cultural links with the indigenous Ainu people of Japan. Indeed, we celebrated those deep ties in a moving joint historic event exactly 2 years ago at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC. We would also like to begin by acknowledging the many victims of the great Tohoku earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crisis that befell Japan 10 years ago on March 11, 2011. Thousands died from the triple disaster, and hundreds of thousands had their lives completely upended. As our Center of Japanese Research noted last week on our website, we're reminded of the immense damage left by 3/11, but also the resilience of those impacted and our connections to Japan across the Pacific. We continue to feel a strong connection between BC and Japan as we share the Pacific Rim of Fire. In fact, about 8 million tons of debris from Fukushima ended up drifting to the coast of BC, including a complete motorbike that was later returned to its owner in Japan. Also, on January 26, 1700, that's 300 years ago, the last great Pacific Northquake earthquake struck the full Pacific induction zone from northern BC all the way down to California. It was followed by a huge tsunami that swamped many indigenous villages here in BC and entire forests. The tsunami crossed the Pacific and struck Japan at midnight without warning as a great orphan tsunami, destroying villages such as Otsuchi, Kuwagasaki, and many others up and down the coast. And in fact, we have most of our written record on this tsunami from the Japanese records. Our Museum of Anthropology is currently hosting a large exhibition to mark the 10th anniversary of the Great East Japan earthquake, entitled A Future for Memory and curated by Fuyubi Nakamura. The exhibition addresses how we deal with memory when our physical surroundings are drastically altered. It focuses on the changing physical and psychological landscapes in the aftermath of 3/11 and shows that regional disasters have global relevance. Events such as 3/11 force us to rethink our ways of life in relation to nature. The works in the exhibition trigger memories, emotions, and imagination, and a lot of it is accessible online. Our webinar tonight focuses on the nuclear crisis that affected the Fukushima Daiichi plant with its 6 nuclear reactors and 7 spent fuel pools, with further risk for the 4 reactors of the Fukushima Daini plant that was just 12 kilometers away. When analyzing the lessons from the crisis today, we are also cognizant of the fact that the crisis could have been much, much worse. As the operator contemplated evacuating the plant on March 5th, 4 days after the earthquake, Prime Minister Kan Naoto spent sleepless nights contemplating the possible required evacuation of the 50 million people who lived within a 250-kilometer radius, and that included Tokyo. In 2017, in his book titled My Nuclear Nightmare, he writes, quote, "The approximately 160,000 people who live near the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant who were evacuated faced great uncertainties. They have suffered greatly. If 50 million people had in fact been evacuated, the confusion and adversity that awaited them would have been truly unimaginable. And this was not an ideal fantasy. It was so close to becoming a reality." He also writes a few pages later in the book, "A lot of our institutions, governments, even our culture had revolved around the conviction that a nuclear accident would not occur. One could say we were totally unprepared. So when an accident actually happened, we were unable to handle it because we had presumed that a major accident could not occur. There was no system in place for the management of a crisis." I would like to give special thanks to my three co-organizing colleagues, Professor Shiroyama Hideaki-san at Todai, Professor Alison McFarland, the director of the SPPGA here at UBC, and Professor M.V. Ramana, the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security at the SPPGA. I would also like to give special thanks to our wonderful CGR assistant, Saya Soma-san, who led most of the organization of this event, along with Megumi Hashiguchi-san at Todai. Amazingly, Saya-san's furusato is Rebun Island in the far north of Japan. I have a couple logistical announcements. The chat function has been disabled. Questions should be asked in the Q&A window. Please also note that this webinar and following Q&A session will be recorded. We will make it available on the UBC, SPPGA, and CGR websites, and University of Tokyo will also share it for a limited period of time. You are not required to use your camera or microphone to participate in a Q&A session. Written questions can be submitted to everyone via the Q&A function and are voted by you. I'm now turning the microphone to our UBC president, Professor Santa Ono, for welcoming remarks.
Good morning to those of you in Japan, and good evening to those of you who, like me, are in British Columbia. It was 10 years ago, in March of 2011, that we learned of the disastrous accident involving multiple nuclear reactors in Fukushima, the most serious nuclear accident since the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. Today, we commemorate the 10th anniversary of that accident and reflect on the lessons that can be learned from what happened there. We will hear a variety of perspectives on Fukushima and its lessons. The speakers include high-level regulators, academics, and activists who have all been deeply involved in analyzing the Fukushima accident and various topics related to nuclear energy and energy policy. Today's discussion also brings together two leading universities from Canada and from Japan, the University of British Columbia and the University of Tokyo, and their public policy schools. UBC and UTokyo have a long history of fruitful collaboration, and this event is just the latest example. This event is just one of several activities at UBC commemorating Fukushima, including a major exhibition entitled A Future for Memory: Art and Life After the Great East Japan Earthquake at our Museum of Anthropology. UBC is committed to both commemorating and learning from the experience and incorporating this into research it is carrying out, especially in the realm of public policy. Energy governance is vitally important for the future of our planet, as is the need to grapple with complex risk management. In that regard, we have so much to learn from the events of the disaster of March 2011. Both UBC and the University of Tokyo have considerable expertise and interest in these issues. In closing, I'd like to thank the organizers of today's event, the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, and the Center for Japanese Research at UBC, and the Graduate School of Public Policy and Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. I would like to give special thanks to the Director of the SPPGA, Dr. Alison McFarlane, who brings great personal expertise in the question of nuclear management. Best wishes for a productive and stimulating discussion.
Thank you for those words. I'm now going to turn the microphone to Professor Shiroyama Hideaki-san, my colleague at Todai, who is going to introduce our next speaker. Professor Shiroyama is the Deputy Director of the Institute for Future Initiatives and a professor at the Graduate School of Law and Politics and the Graduate School of Public Policy at Todai. His earlier assignments included Director of the Policy Alternative Research Institute at Todai and Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy at Todai as well. Program the Science, Technology and the Innovation Governance Education and Research Program. His research areas include public administration, international administration, and science, technology, and public policy. And I've also treasured his friendship for almost 20 years now. So, Shiroyama-san.
Yeah, thank you, Yves-san. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Naoto Sekimura. He is the Vice President of the University of Tokyo in charge of the international affairs, the university partnership, and also happened to be actually also the nuclear engineering by training, and best fit to the opening remarks to this symposium. So Professor Sekimura, floor is yours, please.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Naoto Sekimura, Vice President of the University of Tokyo in charge of global engagement and international affairs. On behalf of the University of Tokyo, I would like to thank all the panelists and participants in this symposium organized by UBC and the University of Tokyo. The University of Tokyo and the UBC have been promoting research collaborations and international exchanges between the two universities, including the conclusion in April 2017 of the agreement between the Max Planck Institute in Germany, UBC, and the University of Tokyo, as well as the international friendly matches between the University of Tokyo baseball team and the UBC Thunderbirds, the UBC's baseball team. I visited UBC campus to watch the baseball games between us in August 2019 with our President Gono Kami. We were invited to Norman Mackenzie House, the residence of President Ono. After the excellent dinner, President Gono Kami was presented with UBC's President's Medal for his contributions to strengthening mutual collaborations in higher education internationally. And last week, on March 9, 2021, the UBC U-Tokyo President's Talk took place, with the presidents taking part in the events. At the end of the talk, the President Gono Kami presented virtually a commemorative shield to President Ono for all his support and efforts in furthering the relations between the UBC and the University of Tokyo. As introduced by Professor Shiroyama, I'm a professor in the Department of Nuclear Engineering and Management of the University of Tokyo, working for nuclear safety and risk management I'm currently collaborating with the regulatory body, NRA, in Japan, as a chairperson of the Nuclear Safety Examination Committee. I was also one of the contributors of the report of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident issued by the Atomic Energy Society of Japan in 2014, compiling 50 recommendations in 5 different categories, including items related to direct causes of the accident, also to organizational issues among underlying causes as transdisciplinary issues in regulatory bodies, operators, industries, as well as research institutes and academia. So I would like to thank again Professor Shiroyama and all the speakers in the panel today. I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion here online, even under these difficult times of the COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sekimura. So now we'd like to move to the first panel. The panel 1 is the view from the regulators and leaders, lessons from the Fukushima for Japan and the world with respect to nuclear energy and systemic risk management. We have 2 prominent panelists today, Professor Suzuki and Professor McFarlane. So we'd like to get the initial presentation for 15 minutes from each speaker. Then after that, we have a cross-cutting discussion, and also we'd like to respond to the question you raised in the Zoom function. So first speaker is Professor Tatsujiro Suzuki. Professor Suzuki is the Vice Director and the Professor of the Research Center for the Nuclear Weapon Abolition at the Nagasaki University, so-called RECNA, Japan. Before joining RECNA, he was the Vice Chairman of the Japan Atomic Energy Commission of the Cabinet Office from the January 2010 to March 2014. He's also now a member of the Advisory Board of the Parliament's Special Committee on Nuclear Energy since June 2017. And he is also the council member of the PAGOSH Conference on Science and World Affairs. And actually, he used to be a colleague at the GRASP, Graduate School of Public Policy, as a visiting professor working on the science technology governance issue. And he got his PhD from nuclear engineering from the University of Tokyo. So the floor is yours, Professor Suzuki, please.
Thank you for the introduction. Let me share my slide. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to this important workshop. My talk is on particularly my personal lessons on Fukushima, and also as a country and also as a global community. What can we learn from the Fukushima? First of all, this is my first my personal reflection. Before I talk about this, like Sekimura Sensei, I was trained as a nuclear engineer, and I have been studying nuclear energy policy for a long time. As an expert, I really felt a strong responsibility for what happened. How could we prevent? How couldn't we prevent the accident? So I have to express my first sincere apology for the people who suffered from the accident. I will talk about this later, but still many people are away from home. And then as an engineer, I thought that the nuclear power is probably safe. And my research was much more on the nuclear proliferation or nuclear security, which I thought was posed much greater risk. I was wrong. And in addition to the so-called engineering risk, which tend to be expressed by numbers, particularly the number of deaths per kilowatt hour, that's the measure we use, that is not good enough. That's my lesson. we have to assess social, political, economic risks, even including probably ethical risk. And basically, once the accident happened, this has become a human security issues, and we have to include social scientists or religious people or any other expertise to assess the risk of nuclear energy. And protection of human life is not good enough. In addition to the people's lives, the land contamination, water, all these impacts should be also assessed, which is quite significant. Of course, economic cost is huge also. And as of today, about 36,000 people are still away from home from Fukushima. And we have to consider those people's restoring their life and life of people. That's the first priority. This is my personal reflection. Everything I talk about is coming from this, my personal reflection. And the most important lesson I learned from Fukushima is called think unthinkable. This is the quote I come from the interim report by the Government Investigation Committee. They call the so-called fundamental paradigm shift in thinking about disaster prevention and safety. I don't know this has happened in Japan yet. And thinking unthinkable is very difficult to do. It's easy to say, but it's very difficult to do. And resilience is another key word, but it means that the worst thing could happen. So we have to prepare for the unexpected events. And then eventually we have to respond to the event to restore a life. So those two things are my most important lessons I learned. Okay, what happened to Japan? First of all, energy supply structure changed quite significantly. Before Fukushima, 54 units of nuclear power, about 49 gigawatts operating in Japan. Now it's only 9 units operating, only 9 gigawatts. And share of nuclear power dropped from 25% to roughly 6%. And instead, we expand the share of coal and natural gas and renewables. So in a sense, Japan has already shifted to the society not depending on nuclear power too much. Public opinion has also changed quite significantly. Before Fukushima, almost 80% of the people thought nuclear power is necessary. That share dropped to roughly 25% in 2013. And right now, only 12% of the public believe that nuclear power should be maintained or expanded, and roughly 60% or more believe that nuclear energy should be phased out or shut down immediately. This is a fundamental shift in public opinion. Okay, has the Japanese government nuclear industry learned the accident? First, it seemed like so. At the strategic energy plan published by METI in 2014 and 2018, both said clearly that we have to learn from the lesson from Fukushima accident, and basically Japan will reduce its dependency on nuclear power as much as possible. However, at the same time, the energy plan says we have to maintain nuclear power as a base load electricity. And just last year, December, the METI published a new report in order to achieve the carbon neutrality in 2050. They put the nuclear power as a so-called growth sector. So this is quite a change from this so-called policy to reduce the nuclear dependency. And my message today is this. Remember that accident is not over yet. We have quite challenging tasks remain at the decommissioning of the Fukushima Daiichi. As you may probably know, that one of the urgent issue is what to do with the so-called contaminated water. It has to be treated, and right now they have huge millions of water, so-called treated water, tritium, including only tritium, but the huge amount of tritium still remain, and the government plan is to dilute the tritium and much below the regulatory standard, so that it should be safe to the water, to the seawater. However, it was revealed that the TEPCO did not disclose the data which showed that the so-called treated water contained higher than the regulatory standard radioactive materials. So because of that event, the public, particularly the local fishermen's group, lost the trust in the nuclear industry, particularly TEPCO and the government. So right now, the only 13% of the people are in favor of the release into the sea. So this is a public policy issue right now, what to do with this. And also, just last month, we had a relatively large earthquake near Fukushima, and may have caused damage on the reactor unit 1 and 3, because the water level, which needs to still keep cooling the melted debris, is decreasing. And it means that it still continue right now. Eventually, it could lead to the release of the radioactive material to the air. So this is a serious incident. And this reminded us of that the risk still remains on site. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen to the end of the state of the decommissioning and also the decontaminated area. And total accident cost also huge. Government estimate, which was done in 2016, it's already 22 trillion yen. But our team at the Japan Center for Economic Research suggested this should be much, much higher, because the government estimate does not include the final cost of radioactive waste disposal. So this is a chart. This is a picture of the Fukushima area right now. This red zone, still we cannot go back to the area, and green zone has been designated as now you can go back, but still this allowed to this average dose rate for criteria is 20 millisievert per year. This seems to be very high to me. Anyway, and now, but still, many areas people don't want to go back, and about 36% people are still away from home. The compensation amount is going to increase also. Currently already $92 billion. All right. What about the safety culture of the nuclear industry? It was reported just the last month that TEPCO at Kashiwazaki Kariha nuclear power plant, they had an illegal entry by an employee with a false ID card. This is a serious security breach at the plant. And then we were also reported just yesterday, TEPCO did not repair the detectors for intrusion of illegal entry. 15 of them are not repaired. So this is a serious security breach. I quoted this sentence from the comment made by the chair, a person of the Nuclear Regulation Authority. Because of this event, probably TEPCO will not be able to restart this Kashiwazaki Kariwa plant. Japan Atomic Power also had a problem. They reported to erase the data which were supposed to submit to the Nuclear Regulatory Authority. The data was omitted because they could undermine their argument that there is no active geological fault underneath the plant. So those kind of events will undermine the trust in the nuclear industry. And I'm thinking right now, this kind of events makes me believe that the safety and security culture has not been restored at the nuclear industry. And now we have a very tough independent nuclear regulators, but still public believe that the accident could happen. Only 21% believe that the nuclear power could be secured safely. and roughly, 30% or so still good nuclear power could have a serious accident. And so this is a public opinion right now against the nuclear safety. Another serious issue is evacuation plan, which is not part of the regulatory license process in Japan. So it's not clear who is responsible to approve the evacuation plan. And my thinking is that there's no enough communication between the regulators and utilities, government, and the public, particularly with the local public. We need a platform to share the safety information as much as possible. And this one is the Japanese utilities try to establish so-called self-regulation measures in Japan, also following the successful example of the United States. They established so-called Nuclear Safety Institute, JANSI, a Japanese version of Institute of Nuclear Power Operators in the United States, which was successful in improving the performance in the United States since after the TMI accident. But I don't think this is good enough. I think Shirayama sensei knows that also this self-regulation very well. And my thinking is that self-regulation has to have a more strong oversight function. At this moment, that's not good enough. We don't have it in Japan. And they also established the Nuclear Risk Research Center, trying to introduce officially the more probabilistic risk assessment. PRA has been used in Japan informally by private industry, but it's the regulation, it does not still be based on this so-called risk-informed decision-making. And they also established institution trying to improve the communication with the NRA called Atomic Energy Association. But these are basically following the US successful examples. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but at this moment, this is not really making a big progress. The final sentence here is that the chair, the director of the Nuclear Research Center, Professor George Apostolakis, mentioned that in Japan, introducing probabilistic assessment technique is difficult because this is a different culture. That's what he said. So it is difficult to improve so-called risk-informed decision-making process in Japan. And finally, I'd like to also talk about the debate in Japan. Right now, Japan's policy debate is polarized between so-called pro or anti-nuclear power. There are many issues that we have to solve regardless of the future of nuclear power. Decommissioning of Fukushima nuclear waste, spent fuel management, nuclear safety, evacuation plan, all these things should be discussed beyond pro or anti-nuclear power. And in addition to that, we don't have a lack of independent oversight organizations, and information source only come from either pro or anti-nuclear power that will inhibit the so-called constructive and positive dialogue among the people. So my recommendation to restore public trust, we have to recognize that accident is not over yet. And also we have to focus on the issues that need to be resolved regardless of the future of nuclear energy. And 3 important measures are necessary. This is a common thing for all public policy, probably not only for nuclear energy policy. Improve transparency, complete information disclosure, public participation in decision-making process, and an independent oversight organization. Thank you very much. Shirayama-san, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Suzuki-sensei, for giving us a comprehensive view, and especially the issue of the trust, which is very important, maybe the topic for the the panel discussion. So now we'd like to move to the next speaker, Dr. Alison McFarlane. Dr. McFarlane is currently the professor and director of the School of the Public Policy and Global Affairs and the Faculty of Arts at the UBC, the co-organizer of this event. She is the first geologist to chair the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission from the 2012 to 2014. And Dr. McFarlane holds a doctorate in the earth science from the MIT and Bachelor of Science from the University of Rochester. She has been on the faculty of the George Washington University and Georgia Tech and George Mason University. From 2010 to 2012, Dr. McFarlane served on the White House Blue Ribbon Commission on the Americans' Nuclear Future. She serves on the Nuclear and Radiation Studies Board of the U.S. National Academy of Science. So Professor McFarlane, floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Hiromi-san. I am going to share my screen. Hopefully get it going here. Let's see. Okay, is that working for everybody?
Yes, we can see. Yep.
Okay, so I'm also going to talk about lessons learned and those not learned from the Fukushima accident, and you'll probably hear a lot in common with Suzuki-san and his excellent remarks of a moment ago. And I will try to bring it a little broader and talk about a few other countries, especially the United States, where I served as on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And just as a brief reminder of the accident, of course, this massive earthquake created a massive tsunami, which at the Fukushima plant quickly drowned all the backup systems, the backup safety systems, which were in line and being used because offsite power had been knocked out to the plant. And so the plant fell into something called station blackout, every nuclear engineer's nightmare. And eventually 3 of the 6 reactors melted down with subsequent explosions and massive damage. And, you know, the aftermath, of course, a fair amount of land contamination and even more contamination went out to the sea. This was actually the good news scenario. And as Suzuki-san mentioned, one of the big issues is dealing with the contaminated water. Here's a picture of some of the tanks at the site. And of course, he mentioned the nuclear waste. Those are fields of bags of nuclear waste from cleanup of contaminated soil, et cetera, in the area. So there's a lot to deal with in the aftermath. I was able to visit the site in 2012, and we actually got to climb onto Unit 4, where the spent fuel pool was very full, and there were a lot of concerns about it, which I'll talk about in a minute, but got some firsthand experience there as well, which I'm sure a number of my colleagues here on these panels have as well. So what we should have learned. And Suzuki-san mentioned some of this, but I see this over and over in discussions about the Fukushima accident and discussions about the 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl accidents. And you see something like recently, a few days ago, Doug Saunders in the Globe and Mail in Canada said, amid all the tsunami and evacuation deaths, the reactor itself proved close to harmless, which I think is actually quite insulting and quite a harmful statement for all the many thousands of people who experienced massive harm from this. A few years ago, Michael Schellenberger in Forbes said the radiation from Fukushima and 3 Mile Island will kill 0 people. In other words, the main lesson that should be learned from the worst nuclear accident is that nuclear energy has always been inherently safe. Again, one of the first lessons we should learn is that dead people isn't a relevant metric for understanding nuclear accidents. People lost land, community, jobs, industries, family, 160,000 evacuated, not that many have returned. The economic costs have been enormous. I don't think we even really fully understand the economic costs, because the costs estimates for decontamination, decommissioning the facilities, and compensating the people alone is in the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. This doesn't account for electricity market impacts, upgrades to existing plants, the fact that so many reactors have permanently shut down in Japan. So all of this should be considered in licensing plants, I would argue. Lesson number 2, we should not underestimate what in English we refer to as Mother Nature. We certainly don't understand natural hazards perfectly, and our understanding is constantly improving and evolving. And this lesson was very clear from Fukushima, that we hadn't understood both the seismic hazards and the flooding hazards. And many nuclear industry folks in many countries and many regulators took this lesson away. Of course, we should also evaluate other natural hazards like hurricane force winds and fire, and those hazards that are going to affect us from climate change. In the United States, many countries, by the way, require periodic review of many aspects of this. And in the United States, in any case, many of the plants, the existing nuclear power plants that are there, were evaluated based on 40-year-old understanding of these natural hazards. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission had actually required, as a result of the Fukushima accident, a reevaluation of the both the seismic hazards and the flooding hazards. And this was in process until January 2019, when the 3 Republican members of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission voted to abandon this reevaluation. So the importance of these periodic reviews can't be overestimated. A third lesson is that we need to manage the back end of the fuel cycle. And if we don't plan for this, it can have implications for accidents. And we saw this again at Fukushima. In Unit 4, I mentioned the pool earlier at Unit 4. It was almost full with freshly discharged, very hot fuel. And when the accident happened, there was no electricity, so therefore no pumping of water into the pool and no circulation of water into the pool. And the fuel itself was very hot, so there was the potential for this water to boil off. In fact, it began to boil off. And the problem was that if the spent fuel itself was uncovered, there would have been a fire and there would have been massive release of radiation. And this massive release of radiation could have affected area all the way down to Tokyo. And in fact, it turns out that Unit 4's pool was within some days of uncovering the spent fuel before they finally were able to successfully get water into that pool. So why did this happen? In part because of inadequate planning for the back end of the fuel cycle. There wasn't a final solution for dealing with the nuclear waste. In Japan, there were plans to reprocess the spent fuel. The reprocessing facility was delayed. It still doesn't operate. And so the amount of spent fuel began to build up at reactor sites. And I would argue that we can't really operate nuclear energy responsibly without having a clear and decided plan for dealing with all levels of nuclear waste. Another lesson from the accident is sometimes that there are straightforward solutions to safety problems. And so one lesson that initially came from 3 Mile Island, but certainly came from Chernobyl, and then again from Fukushima, is that if you want to prevent radiation contamination of land near and far away from the reactor, you can actually do this if you are monitoring what's going on at the reactor and can vent any gases that contain radiation and direct those gases into a tank of water. The water will strip off a lot of that radiation. So it's a pretty simple solution. After the Chernobyl accident, a number of countries in Europe implemented these tanks. The problem with the Chernobyl accident was that there was no containment building, but if you look at the figure, the this green area, the outline of the green area, is the containment building around the reactor. And that containment building is about 1 meter thick of steel reinforced concrete. Pressure can build up in the case of a nuclear power accident so that containment building can be breached. You want to be able to release those gases so you don't breach that containment building, so you don't have a wild and uncontrolled release of radiation. If you can make those vents where you release that radiation capable of directing the piping the gases into a pool, you can solve the problem, and it's not such an expensive fix. And many countries have either done this or are in the process of doing it, but you can see there are 4 countries, including the United States, that have decided not to do this. And the US, again, is one of these countries that has not learned this lesson. 5th lesson, and almost the last lesson, is the importance of an independent regulator. And what's an independent regulator? An independent regulator is one that is not influenced politically or by industry. It also has to be well-resourced. It has to have both financial resources and human resources, adequate human resources. It has to have the support of the central government, and it has to have the ability to shut down plants that they see are unsafe. If you don't have an independent regulator, and the National Diet of Japan, after the accident, said itself that part of the root cause of the Fukushima accident was collusion between the regulator, industry, and the government. If you don't have an independent regulator, your country's at great risk in terms both economically and public health. And it's important to actually, as Suzuki-san said, to look at the safety culture that is behind independent regulation. It's not just important to have a active safety culture at nuclear power plants and in the nuclear industry, but also in the regulator. And basically, a definition of safety culture that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the United States uses is the core values and behaviors resulting from a commitment by leaders and individuals to emphasize safety over other goals to ensure protection of people and the environment. And you can regulate for this, and this is done in the United States. And then finally, the final lesson is that transparent communication is essential to public trust. I think the Fukushima accident was characterized by a lack of information by changes to radiation dose standards that were made midstream, by the potential for food and sea and marine life contamination, and the fact that it came out afterwards that some of the regulators had modeled the spread of radiation but didn't communicate this, and so people were allowed to go into harm's way. And so the corollary of this lesson is that if you don't have public trust, you probably won't have a robust nuclear industry in a democracy. So I will leave you with those 6 lessons and a picture of Fukushima before the accident. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor McFarlane, for raising the 6 important lessons learned from the Fukushima case. So we'd like to have maybe the 20 minutes discussion, and at the last part, we'd like to respond to the question-based. So we have 1 question, but maybe we'd like to wait a little bit until some more questions will be coming. So thank you very much for those 2 presentations. And I think some of the message is very overlapping. And the first point is that, impact of the accident have to be broadly framed, including the social impact and economic impact. That's emphasized by the Suzuki sensei, but that's repeated by the Professor McFarlane. So that's important part. And also the last part, importance of the safety culture and the transparent communication to trust. That seems to be very overlapping and important point, which is raised by both of the panelists, I think. Having that kind of common basis, I'd like to make a few questions, maybe first to the Professor Suzuki. And the one point is that the safety culture issue. And one of the points that Professor McFarlane raised is that safety culture is not just the issue of the industry, that's also matter to the regulator. So somehow to say some co-evolution might be needed. And in the previous discussion of the Professor Suzuki, you focus on some of the misconduct by the mainly operators, industry side, and how to make sure the safety culture of industry seems to be one of the key priority area in your presentation. So how do you think about the role of the regulator in the process for strengthening the safety culture, and maybe relating to that, maybe what should be the relationship between the regulator and the regulated industry, especially for the transparent communication. So if you have any the point relating to that, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I quite agree with Alison that safety culture is needed for across the industry and also the government also, of course, and even probably people like us. We think that there is always a trade-off between improving the safety versus probably economics or life or whatever, and that's we have to put the top priority on the safety. And but I think one important lesson from the United States, I was in MIT 1980s and 1990s, that improving the safety performance and the economic performance can go together. And INPO succeeded in doing both. And it is not contradictory that if you want to improve the safety, you also improve the economic efficiency of the industry. So there is no evidence that the deregulation of electric industry undermine the safety of nuclear power plants in the United States. So safety culture, improving safety culture should also improving the economic efficiency of the industry. So I think that for industry and the government and us, all of us also, putting a safety first will eventually improve the quality of life and economics of the society. That's my point.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sensei. Maybe relating to this point, I'd like to also hear from the Professor McFarlane a little bit more. As you mentioned that safety culture is not just the issue of the industry, regulator included, but having said that, we are still very much interested in how the industry can realize the kind of the potential win-win situation, economy and safety from the industry side. So we are so much, actually, the Suzuki Sensei and I once visited the INPO for interview relating to that, and we are so much interested in that issue. So how the industry motivate themselves for the self-regulation, not just the peer review, as Suzuki Sensei mentioned, that the kind of the mutual inspection system, which is enabled partly because of the multiplicity of the operator in the case of US compared to Japan, relatively monopolized into the 6 operators. So how to motivate the industry to self-regulate? If you have any thought on that, that's a question I'd like to ask from Professor McFarlane. And another point is that relating to the independent regulator, the resources, the financial resources and human resources are important. That's easily understandable. But also, how to enhance the capability of the regulators? Sorry, a little bit too general question, but that's also important, especially in the current situation of Japan. And after the reorganization of the nuclear safety regulation, now we have a relatively big nuclear regulatory authorities, more than 1,000, I think, and altogether, including the former the regulator and the Nuclear Safety Commission Secretariat, and also the so-called independent regulatory agency was incorporated. So the number is large. Now under the currently of the Environmental Ministry, altogether only about 1,000. Previously, they have another 1,000 only for the nuclear regulation. So concerning number, we have relatively enough people, but not enough, I'm not sure. But the issue might be how to make sure the kind of capacity building of the regulators. That seems to be a current challenge. So in that respect, if we can hear from your experience, that might be helpful. So if you have any comment, please let us know.
Thanks. In terms of getting the industry on board in terms of doing some self-regulation and peer review, I understand the challenge if you have only 6 operators versus, I don't know how many there are in the US, but many. It's easier to do a peer review. But everybody has to buy into the belief that it's important to self-regulate, that safety culture is important to implement. And it's in some ways it's a leap of faith. If you're not used to that, it can be, scary because you have to give up some power.
Mm.
And, I found that the most important aspect of safety culture is leadership. The leadership has to buy into it. The leadership has to feel secure enough that they allow the people who work for them to have a voice. And they have to feel not threatened by somebody challenging them. And if that's okay, then you'll have a good safety culture. But you have to model it yourself. It's very important. So leadership is really important in this. And I would say in terms of the industry and getting the industry to self-regulate, they need the government to say, this is really important. If the government wants to expand nuclear energy in Japan, the government has to say, yeah, we're going to allow space for you to do this kind of thing and to provide peer review. And you should be harsh on each other, because otherwise you won't be a vibrant energy source. And in terms of the regulators, again, it comes back to the government wanting to have a robust regulator. It has to be important. And I think what Professor Suzuki said was really right. It's to their benefit economically to have both a strong regulator and to have a strong safety culture. But if they don't see that, I don't know what to do. It's 10 years later. You had 54 reactors operating, and now you have 9. What more evidence do you need?
Mm. Yeah, thank you very much. And okay, we do have several questions and answers. So if you have a chance, please look through that. And one of the issue raised by the question is the issue of the waste management issue, which is raised by the Professor McFarlane. And Suzuki Sensei, you have any comment about the issue of the waste management, especially the possibility and the difficulty of that, and especially relating to the point you raised at the last part of the presentation, the current situation of the polarized debate, and how the issue of the waste management should be discussed in the current situation in Japan. If you have any comment on that, please let us know.
One lesson we learned from Fukushima accident is that, for instance, the so-called exercise, emergency exercise, it's before the Fukushima, it was kind of pre-arranged, based on pre-arranged scenario, and there's no unexpected challenges to the people who are attending the exercise. And risk management should include the situation that the people face unexpected events. And so I think the one particular recommendation, and which have not been implemented yet, is to improve the emergency exercise, not based on the scenario base, but based on series of unexpected events, so that people how can people respond? And also, there was a discussion at that time, right after the accident, kind of government agency like a FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Authority or agency in the United States, that we need a centralized the government agency which can manage the all kind of risk. And it did not succeed in establishing it, but I think we need this is the government agency's response, risk management experiences. I look at when I was there, it's coordination or sharing the information was very, very chaotic. So I think we need to improve how can we share the information on a real-time basis. I think sharing the information is very, very important to understand what's happening. That wasn't the case in the Fukushima accident. So I think sharing the information on a real-time basis and how to coordinate in response to the unexpected things. This is very important. And in order to improve that, we need experts, and also we need many repeated exercises to respond to that kind of situation.
Yeah, thank you very much. And okay, so moving to the question, and one question raised was that, how the lesson learned from the Chernobyl is actually implemented and in preparation for the possible Fukushima, and how the previous accident was not learned. Now we are discussing about lesson learned and unlearned from the Fukushima accident, but looking back historically, how would the lesson learning relating to Chernobyl, and so the lesson was the learn from Chernobyl, but not enough, or the learning itself is not enough, or so that seems to be the part of the center of the question. Then the related issue might be that we have a accident, the 3 Mile and Chernobyl and Fukushima. Of course, some common element exists, and the safety culture is very important. But on the other hand, the concrete form of the accident and the mechanism can be different. So, responding to each accident, different lessons have to be learned. So there might be some difference of the possible lessons which should be learned from the previous accident. So how do you think, from that perspective, the response to the Chernobyl case? That seems to be a question raised, and that might be relating to the issue Suzuki Sensei raised at the beginning. And one of the big lessons is the think about unthinkable, or the unexpected thing. So there can be many possible unexpected, but so how to make sure the coverage of the possible, unthinkable, or unexpected thing. So it seems to be easy to say, but it seems to be a little bit difficult to practice. So those issues are relating to each other. But if you have any comment on this point, I'd like to hear from you. And Professor McFarlane, you have any response on this point?
Sure. The nuclear industry actually does think through some of this, unlike most other industries. I mean, they do have this discussion about beyond design basis accidents, right? I mean, so you don't see the coal industry or the natural gas industry doing this kind of thinking. So, we should give some credit to the nuclear industry for doing this kind of work, but you have to actually act on this and learn some of these lessons. The Chernobyl, we do have to understand it was a bit different. It was a different reactor design. It did not have a containment, okay? Whereas in Fukushima, all the reactors in Japan, all the reactors in the US and in Canada, we have these reactors with containment. And so that helps. Clearly, it doesn't help completely because look at what happens with Fukushima. But one lesson, as I said, that was learned by the Europeans anyway from the Chernobyl accident was, well, we better add some filters to the vents, and we better be able to operate these vents under accident conditions. And so some countries have learned that. Canada hasn't, the Canadian reactors haven't added these filters yet, but they are looking to do that. The United States has just said no. That's a bit of a problem. I take your point about what you might call fighting the last war, that, you learn from a previous accident, but the next accident is going to be different. But if you do not take into account that operational experience, woe unto you if you experience a similar kind of accident.
Mm.
So if there is an accident in the United States with spread of radiation, and it comes out that basically almost all other countries with nuclear power have added these filters to their vents that could have prevented the spread of radiation, what do you think will happen to the nuclear industry in the United States? I'd say it will disappear.
Okay, thank you. So, Suzuki Sensei, can I just give us short, if you have something to say?
After the Chernobyl, we have a keyword that the nuclear industry said that any accident anywhere in the world could affect all over global nuclear industry. However, when I talk with the nuclear industry in Japan, that was Russia. That was Soviet Union's poor practice. And that kind of mentality remained in Japan. Even after Fukushima, some of the utility officials saying, that's TEPCO's problem. And even within TEPCO, that was Fukushima's problem. That was the mentality that still remained. That's the problem. I think we should think whole through, as Alison said, any accident should learn from it. And any accident could affect all of us. So that's the kind of core lesson we should continue to learn, not forget.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for Professor Suzuki and Professor McFarlane for having an in-depth discussion. And as we discussed at the last moment, and still we have many lessons which should be shared from the case. That's the important point. And also, as you both mentioned at the beginning, and how to assess the global impact, integrated impact, including the economics and social impact. That's an issue not just for the Fukushima. Maybe we were facing the similar kind of issue relating to the response to the COVID-19, a common element of the response to the complex risk governance issue. So maybe this is also another very important issue we have to face. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'd like to close the first panel here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now I'm going to turn my mic to the Yves, who will chair the second session. イブさん、よろしくお願いします。
どうもありがとうございます。Thank you, Hideaki-san. Thank you, Suzuki-san. Thank you, Alison. That was splendid, fascinating. So we'll carry over some of the questions that were not answered yet to the second panel. So no worries for those who raise questions. If you need to stretch this moment, catch a drink, this is, you can take a minute. I'll start by introducing the speakers, and so feel free to do that. We're going to start the second panel, looking now at the lessons of Fukushima for risk assessment, risk governance, and social resilience. And we have a wonderful panel bringing different types of expertise. We'll first have Professor M.V. Ramana, professor here at Simons Chain Disarmament, Global and Human Security, director of the Liu Institute for Global Issues at the SPPJ at UBC. He's the author of The Power of Promise, Examining Nuclear Energy in India, 2012, 2003. He's also a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials, the Canadian Pugwash Group, and the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group, as well as the team that produces the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report. He's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Leo Szilard Award from the American Physical Society. Second to speak will be Professor Suzuki Kazuto, professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy at Todai. He graduated from Ritsumeikan, received a PhD from Sussex European Institute in England. He served as an expert in a panel of experts for Iranian Sanction Committee under the UN Security Council from 2013 to 2015. His research focuses on the conjunction of science, technology, and international relations. Subjects including space policy, non-proliferation, export control, and sanctions. Third, a little change in the program. I'll ask directly to Caitlin Stronell from Citizens Nuclear Information Center to speak third. She completed a PhD in political studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Her research focuses on the Indian anti-nuclear movement. She works as a researcher with the Citizens Nuclear Information Center, an NPO based in Tokyo. She's the editor of CNIC's English newsletter, and her research at CNIC focuses on Japan's nuclear fuel cycle policy and plutonium stockpile. She's a visiting professor at Musashino University, where she teaches environmental English in the engineering faculty, and she's a visiting researcher at Gifu Women's University. Next, we're very happy to be joined by Professor Daniel Aldrich, professor of political science and public policy and urban affairs, and the director of the Security and Resilience Studies program at Northeastern University. His work focuses on two main themes: the role of networks in disasters and crisis, and the interaction between civil society and the state. He has written award-winning books, including Black Wave, How Connections and Governance Shaped Recovery from Japan 311 disaster, 311, and Disasters and Building Resilience, Social Capital in Post-Disaster Recovery. His research has been published in scientific reports, Journal of Environmental Management, Natural Hazards, Wires, Climate Change, and Social Science and Medicine, among many journals. He did his PhD from Harvard in 2005. And then we'll have Professor Matsuo Makiko-san, who is currently serving as project assistant professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy at Todai, where she engages in teaching and research in the Science, Technology, and Innovation Governance Education and Research program. Her research area covers various interdisciplinary approaches, such as risk studies, technology assessment, and consideration of ethical, legal, and social implications in order to address interface governance issues between science and politics. So that's a terrific lineup of very diverse expertise. And I'll turn first to Professor Ramana.
Thank you, Yves. Thank you all for being here. It's a great honor to be speaking amidst so many distinguished people and my friends from a long time back. So as we were all talking about, it's now 10 years after Fukushima, and it's also 35 years after the Chernobyl accident. And I'd like to start by reminding that there are parts of Japan and Ukraine and Belarus that are still uninhabitable because of high radiation levels from those accidents. And the lives of tens of thousands of people continue to be upended by those accidents. And so for anyone who doesn't shut their eyes to these accidents, it should be obvious that nuclear power plants are capable of catastrophic accidents whose effects could reach across space and time. And this is unique to nuclear energy. No other source of electricity generation has this feature. And I would like to sort of focus my talk in terms of risk assessment by asking the question, what is it that allows many proponents of nuclear energy to keep arguing that reactors can be operated safely without accidents? And you'll always hear the term safe nuclear power, right? As though safe is sort of attached to a nuclear power plant automatically, right? And I think that's something which we have to think. For me, the key question is not whether nuclear power can be safe, but whether it will be safe, right? And this question should be asked about safety across different countries, across many facilities operated by a variety of organizations, which have multiple priorities, including cost cutting, profit making, and using multiple technologies, each having its own vulnerabilities, right? It's not possible to sort of rule out across all of them the possibility of accidents. Now, there are two ways of approaching this question. First, there is a history of small and large accidents at nuclear reactors across the world. And this history shows us that accidents occur in most, if not all countries, involving different kinds of reactor designs initiated by internal and external events and with different patterns of progressions. Many of these accidents did not become so major and did not escalate purely by chance, often involving the intervention of human operators rather than any technical safety feature. Such interventions cannot be taken for granted, and so it seems all but inevitable that nuclear reactors will suffer accidents sooner or later. The second and a more deeper level of analysis is that nuclear power plants share some common structural features. The most influential work that explored these features was sociologist Charles Perrow's conceptualization of what happened at 3 Mile Island in 1979 as a normal accident, whose origins lay in the structural characteristics of the system. Perrow and the many other scholars who advanced these ideas since him identified two characteristics, interactive complexity and tight coupling, that make nuclear reactors and similar hazardous technologies prone to catastrophic accidents. Interactive complexity pertains to the potential for hidden and unexpected interactions between different parts of the system, and tight coupling refers to the time dependency of the system and the presence of strictly prescribed steps and invariant sequences in operations that cannot be changed. So given these two structural factors, it's what Perrow and others who have tried to adopt this way of thinking show is that all hazardous technologies for having these features will suffer accidents sooner or later. How then is it that the nuclear industry claims that nuclear reactors are safe? What they usually do is, they talk about something called defense in depth. The fact that there are multiple protective systems, each of which will have to fail before a radioactive release occurs. So one lesson from Fukushima is simply this, that there are going to be occasions when multiple safety systems will fail at the same time. And these occur far more frequently than engineers and technical analysts seem to assume. And so the other corollary from Fukushima is that the methodology that many of these nuclear engineers use, the so-called probabilistic risk assessment techniques, are invariably going to be missing out on various problems, right? They cannot possibly think about all possible ways by which an accident can occur, in which case you cannot calculate the probability of that particular sequence occurring, right? And but nevertheless, based on these kinds of probabilistic risk assessment ideas, the nuclear establishment makes various claims about the frequency of accidents at various reactors. And there are both theoretical and empirical reasons to doubt these numbers. The theoretical reason is what I talked about, the normal accident idea. And the empirical reason is that if you look at the actual rate of accidents at commercial nuclear power plants, that number is far higher than would be predicted by probabilistic risk assessments. The problem is that probabilistic risk assessment models do not account for unexpected failure modes during many accidents. And we've seen this repeatedly. We talked about Fukushima, but even earlier, for example, at the Kashiwazaki Kariba reactors in 2007, when there was an earthquake that struck it, one TEPCO official remarked then, "It was beyond our imagination that a space could be made in the hole on the outer wall for electric cables. Things happen that engineers cannot imagine ahead of time, right? Now, I'd like to push that point a little bit further. During his welcoming remarks, Yves San recalled the words of former Prime Minister Naoto Kan about a worst case scenario involving possible evacuation of 50 million residents in the Tokyo metropolitan area that might have become necessary. But what I'd like to add is that even though this is called a worst case scenario, we can easily imagine even worse case scenarios, right? It is possible, for example, that one of the reactors might not have shut down safely at Fukushima Daiichi, in which case there would have been a massive power excursion because of the loss of cooling, right? The problem is that it is unsafe to presume that plans for nuclear safety take into account all possible contingencies. Unfortunately, as Tatsu-san pointed out in his talk, there is often the use of facile terminology like thinking the unthinkable and things of that sort, but this is never followed because the moment someone brings up even easily thinkable scenarios, the nuclear industry will tell you, oh, that is never going to happen, it is impossible, and so on and so forth, right? So they never really think the unthinkable, okay? And so this is why many of them, for example, the chairman of the Indian Atomic Energy Commission in the aftermath of Fukushima said, nuclear reactors in India are 100% safe, right? That is the kind of statement which is made repeatedly in order to assure the public that it is okay for them to put up with nuclear plants. Now, if all of these statements are just sort of esoteric exercises performed by nuclear engineers for internal consumption, there would not be much reason to be concerned with its lack of reliability. The problem is that things like probabilistic risk assessments produce these very small numbers and which widely seem intended to say that accidents are impossible, right? It creates this false or misplaced concreteness. Again, in his talk, Tatsu-san mentioned a quote by George Apostolakis about Japan not using PRAs. My own take on that quote is that Japan should not adopt the use of PRAs to make any decisions, because PRAs just offer a way to justify decisions that are made for other reasons, right? You can use PRAs to run your safety checks and improve your safety, but you cannot make decisions on the basis of them. I'd also like to add something to what my colleague Alison said about lessons not learned from Fukushima. And I wonder if these lessons can ever be adequately learned and implemented. When you come up with lessons, the idea is that organizations that operate nuclear facilities or other high hazard technologies for that matter would want to implement these in the first place. The problem is that for most organizations, the mission is not being safe. The mission is producing and selling something, right? It could be electricity, it could be chemicals, whatever else it is, right? And quite often it's also the case that non-safety goals are best achieved in ways that are not consistent with designing and operating for lowest risk, right? So in the case of nuclear designers and operators, for example, it could be to produce the most amount of nuclear electricity at the least possible cost. Or it could be to build as many reactors as possible, as rapidly as possible, so as to maintain nuclear power's share of electricity generation and achieve the kind of political power that comes with that kind of production. So these fundamental problems, I think, are serious challenges to achieving any kind of nuclear-free operations at nuclear facilities. And in just about any country that has a significant nuclear sector, those organizations that build or operate nuclear reactors and other facilities wield a significant amount of political power. And this power manifests itself in a variety of ways, including weaker regulation, often made weaker through regulatory capture. This is a reason to wonder whether there are really any truly independent regulators in the nuclear sector. Another way in which the political power of these organizations manifests itself is through mechanisms that allow the externalization and socialization of costs while privatizing profits. This is why nuclear waste, for example, it's a cost that is going to be passed on to the public, to future generations, and a whole bunch of other people who are not responsible or involved in the decision, right? And one example of this kind of socialization of cost that I have looked into in some detail are the liability laws that cap the extent to which nuclear organizations have to pay for accident-related damage and the indemnification of nuclear reactor suppliers. I mean, Japan's case is a little bit more complicated, but in many other countries, for example, in India, international nuclear reactor suppliers force countries to agree to such a flawed liability regime because they can import any reactors. Neither the political power of these organizations or their ability to pass on the cost of these features is conducive to the improvement of safety. More broadly, one of the themes that come out in the wake of the Fukushima is the history of TEPCO's many ways of undermining safety at its plants and covering these up. TEPCO, I would submit, is not unique in this respect. Many nuclear utilities demonstrate similar, though not identical, patterns of behavior. So for all of these reasons, I would say the answer to the question I began with, will nuclear power be safe, is going to be negative. Catastrophic accidents are inevitable with nuclear power. These are not going to be, that does not mean that it's going to be frequent. It's not that every other day there's going to be an accident, but there is good reason to believe that they'll be more frequent than quantitative tools such as probabilistic risk assessments predict. Right? This is what my assessment of the risk from nuclear power is. Any discussion about the future of nuclear power ought to start with the realization that accidents could happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramana, for a very powerful exposition that also actually reminds me of my former Stanford professor, Scott Sagan, with respect to nuclear weapons and organizational failures and potential risks and accidents.
I definitely drew from Scott's work.
Good. Wonderful. So now I'm going to turn to Professor Suzuki Kazuto-sensei, and the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much. I'll just start sharing my slides. Yes, thank you very much for giving me a chance to talk about lessons learned in 10 years. I was involved in the first independent investigation team of Fukushima, organized by the Rebuild Japan initiative, and then later I chaired the investigation commission on the 10 years after Fukushima, which is on the right-hand side, the white book. This is to review the I am not a nuclear scientist or engineers. I am a political scientist, and I've looked through the governance systems and also crisis management mechanism in Japan. So have we learned, the Japanese government learned how to respond to the crisis. So that's the focus of the 10 years investigation. So what we have reviewed are first nuclear safety issues, which are pretty much resonate what Tatsu has mentioned in the first panel. Also, we are looking at how TEPCO has reformed under the Anegawa plan, and also we look at risk communications, how government improved the way in which they communicate with people, which was negative, and the crisis management at the Prime Minister's office. The short summary is, yes, we have, but it's because the Abe government spent 7 years and 8 months, and they have experiences, but the crisis management on the COVID-19 was not extremely well done. The logistics for responders, the Japanese have experienced the Fukushima lack of logistics and lack of preparedness. Are we prepared enough? To a certain extent, yes, but I think if the accidents go beyond the level of Fukushima, we are not prepared. The role of police, firefighters, and self-defense. The paper argue that we haven't really asked the ultimate question, which is who is going to be involved and who is going to be in charge when the accident takes out of their hands. And also we are looking at the construction efforts, about the contaminated water and the and all kinds of reputation risks, etc. There are issues about the risks of not communicating enough, and then the Fukushima is now becoming as a sort of a zombie state because there is no clear outline of the objective and the end state of the reconstruction, so that the government money is poured in the region, and then it becomes as a sort of a living dead in some parts of the industry. And in the conclusions aspect, this is one of the conclusions coming out of our investigation in 10 years of what sort of lessons we learned, and we focused on the nuclear the thinking of the nuclear safety management, and we come up with that the Japanese have developed a new myth of safety. The myth of safety is a concept that that there was a mutual understanding of the people and the operators and the promoters of the nuclear, providing that the nuclear is safe. And I think Ramana has mentioned that, you know, there was a sort of a thinking that this is not possible. The accident will not happen because it's unthinkable. But in fact, the accident happened. So that was people thought that this was an end of myth of safety, because we realized that there was an accident, therefore the nuclear power plant is no longer safe. But the actual thinking of the regulation is now building up into a new myth of safety, which is basically our analysis is that the way of thinking about the regulation has not changed before and after the Fukushima accident, which is what we call the homework style regulation, which means that the regulator gave homework to the operator, and as long as the operator submit all this homework, then people satisfy and understand that this is, you know, the nuclear power plant is safe because we fill all the boxes. If we tick all the boxes, then people think that, okay, it's safe, and therefore accident will not happen. But that's the wrong side of the story, and I think this is same as before and after the the Fukushima accident. So we we dig into this issue, and we are basically we found that this idea of new myth of safety is assuming that the nuclear regulators know everything, and they know everything. They know that there is no way that that reasonably think that there is something that unthinkable, but there is always an unthinkable. So that has the mode of thinking has not changed. That's our message. And furthermore, I think the final goal of the regulation needs to have the communication. I fully agree with Dr. McFarlane and everyone else that we need to have an independent regulator, but the independent regulator does not mean that isolated regulator, isolated from the practices of the operators. Operators need to provide the information and idea to the regulators, and the regulators need to look the realistic options for achieving the further improving the safety. I think one of the problems of this homework style regulation is that there is always the limit, and there is always a goal that you can achieve, and then you need to move towards the goal. But the goalpost is always moving because there is no limit to the safety. So you have to improve the safety all the way to the unlimited level. And in order to do so, you need to have the regulation. You need to have a communication between the regulators and operators. But the problem is that concept of the regulatory capture, which is mentioned in one of the reports after the Fukushima accident. And that makes the Japanese regulator isolated from the practices of the operators. So we found that is not productive in a way to improve the safety regulations. Also, we focus on the analysis of the discourses of the most tough regulation in Japan, in the world. And that is also the extension of this homeward style regulation. So that's the one conclusion. The other conclusion, we have several conclusions, but I'll focus this one as well. The ultimate question: what is going to happen when the things getting out of hands? It has to have someone to take responsibility. The operators, the private industry, and who is primarily responsible for the accident. But when it comes to you need to put your life into the line, then it should have someone like self-defense force to coordinate the operators and the self-defense force. But there is no planning or training in this worst case scenario. So I think this is one of the proof that we thought that we have covered all the worst case scenario, but it's not. So our message is that the greater security is sacrificed by the small comfort, the immediate comfort of the people. People want to feel that they are safe, but that discourses of giving that you are safe is not good enough, because it will give the safety as a whole in danger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzuki Sensei. Those are powerful words. So I'm going to turn now to Dr. Caitlin Strano. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Yves. I don't have any slides, but today I would like to say thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be part of this esteemed panel. I just wanted to mention briefly that I work at Citizens Nuclear Information Center, which is a nonprofit think tank in Tokyo. And our organization was founded actually by a nuclear chemist called Takagi Jinzaburo, who realized that there were problems with the nuclear industry and left, and then founded this organization. And our mission is it's basically a citizen science organization. So what we try and do is empower people to understand nuclear energy enough so that they can make their own decisions. And Dr. Takagi, even though he was a scientist, his main concern about nuclear energy was the type of society it was going to produce. He was worried that it would become completely non-democratic, that the choices of people would be taken away by experts, and that really people should be making choices about their energy future. And so, but to do that, they need to be enabled with information. So that's what our organization does. It's an activist organization rather than an academic organization. So our mission is, our stated mission is to create a nuclear-free world through empowering people and through the power of citizens. So today I would like to talk about the evacuees, the situation with 10 years later after, as Suzuki Sensei mentioned, that there's 36,000 people who have not returned to their homes in Fukushima. I think it's around 24,000 of those. Their homes are in the red zone, the no-go zone, it's called in Japanese, the difficult to return zone. So by law, they're not allowed to return to their homes. But there's also a large number of people who haven't returned, even though the evacuation orders have been lifted. And I would like to say that I think that from the point of view of the evacuees, they feel as though there's been they've been given no choice, and there's also been no justice. So I think that these are important points in terms of, we were talking about regaining public trust, but for these people, the fact that there's been no choices for them and there's been no justice is really a big factor that really makes it very difficult for public trust to be reinstated. So yeah, the 36,000 people who haven't returned to their homes. I think that Alison mentioned the decontamination program that the Japanese government has undertaken. It's cost billions and billions of dollars, and it consists of scraping the top 5 centimeters of soil and put it into those big black bags that we saw in the photo before. So the thing with radiation, once it's released, you can't just make it disappear. You have to move it from one place to another. So it's been moved from people's houses to big black bags and placed in fields. But still, large areas of Fukushima are forest, which means that you can't decontaminate a forest. And so every time it rains, contaminated particles that are on the leaves of the trees and in the soil then wash down and are moved again. So the decontamination program has been it's been very problematic, and has the aim stated at the beginning was that those areas of people's houses would be reduced to 1 millisievert per year, the dose rate, and that hasn't happened. Even in the areas that have been decontaminated, many of them are above 1 millisievert per year. So then the government went back to its old standard of 20 millisieverts, which is what the dose rate was raised to straight after the accident. But many people feel that even though their house, the area around it has been decontaminated, they don't feel safe moving back. But when the government lifted the evacuation orders, they also stopped many of the welfare benefits that evacuees were receiving, which means that people were in many cases forced back to areas where they didn't want to live. Many are still trying to stay. Of course, after 10 years, you tend to build a new life in any case, and it becomes quite difficult to return somewhere, especially if you have young kids who are in schools. In any case, there's the life of these people, and they should be able to make choices about their own life. But the way that the aftermath of the accident has been handled has really prevented them from making choices. And that has been a really serious factor, I think. The other point is that they feel as though really there's been no justice, that actually nobody's really taken responsibility for destroying their lives. And so TEPCO has said, oh, we'll our main priority, we're very sorry about this, and our main priority is to help people that have been affected. But in actual fact, many of the evacuees feel that really they haven't been helped at all. So in terms of compensation, in terms of their lives and again, the choices that they're not allowed to make. So many have resorted to the court cases that there are around 20 or so local court cases that have been brought by Fukushima evacuees, demanding compensation, demanding the various demands. This might not sound like a lot of court cases to maybe people in America, but for Japan, that this is quite a lot of, a large legal kind of movement. And it really is a movement of last resort. It's because they have not been able to get justice in any other way. I think that obviously the financial and the compensation factors are very large, but the fact that nobody has really said, this was my fault and I'm sorry, that nobody has really actually taken responsibility. And so one of the important court cases was launched by Fukushima victims, and that it was a criminal case against 3 of the top TEPCO executives who were in charge at the time. It was quite a speedy court case for Japan. It took a couple of years, but the 3 executives were in the end acquitted. But a lot of information came out during that court case. And I think one of the things that was very shocking for all of us was that it was established that, in fact, TEPCO knew the dangers of a tsunami. Back in 2006, there were committees, there were experts that had told them about this. Even within the company internally, there was a lot of discussion, but it was decided that it would cost too much. So the decision to raise the seawalls and take preventative actions against this tsunami was postponed. And the court showed that, in fact, if they had have listened to this and if they had have acted on it, then, the seawalls would have been much higher, and perhaps the accident could have been prevented. So this kind of information comes out in these court cases. And really what it shows is that that really, in fact, the safety issues do take second place to the profit factor. As Ramana mentioned, basically these organizations, their main objective is not public safety. Their main objective is to sell electricity and make profits. And so that is really the bottom line. So I think there's another case that recently was also not admitted, was the children's radiation case. And there was actually, I think it was something around 20 actual children became plaintiffs in this case, and their parents. But again, these court cases are usually dismissed. In some cases, there has been victories where compensation has been granted, or where the judge has admitted that, in fact, the national government and TEPCO are liable. But then in higher courts, it gets dismissed again. So this fight for justice, I think, is also something that really needs to be addressed. And if people don't feel as though someone has taken responsibility for this accident, if you don't take responsibility, why are you going to change and make things better in the future? I think it was Suzuki Sensei mentioned the Kashiwazaki Kariya case of breach security, where again, with the recent case, and of course, Kashiwazaki Kariya is also operated by TEPCO. And if these are the people who are trying to regain public trust by doing everything right and being on their best behavior, but these sort of breaches still happen, it really means, it's just going to be very, very difficult to regain this public trust. I think that there's many similarities with.
We're running out of time.
Out of time. Okay, I'm just going to end with the idea that the Hibakusha of Fukushima also have an idea of the same sort of feeling as the Hibakusha of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is that we don't want anyone else to have to experience this. And for them, that means basically an end to nuclear power. Okay, sorry, I went over, sorry.
Thank you very much. Those are fascinating, voices that you represented here, the evacuees, and thank you, Caitlin. So I'm going to now turn to Danielle Aldrich, who has been at the forefront of the research on Fukushima actions and policies and networks and all kind of things, mobilization. So thank you, Danielle, for being here.
Thank you all
And the floor is-
very much, and thanks Eve for hosting us. I'll try to stick to my time, and just really quickly, I'll give out my email address and my Twitter handle if people want to ask questions later or have a good discussion we can't finish tonight. Just really quickly, I would start with two major arguments that weak civil society has been the backbone of Japanese nuclear industry now since the 1960s. And as a corollary to that argument, rather than being guided by public opinion on nuclear power, the Japanese government has long sought to control public opinion more broadly. And I'll begin this argument by simply talking about why Japan chose these locations for its, at one point, 54 different nuclear power plants around the country. Of course, they're all on the ocean. Japanese engineers chose sea-cooled rather than lake or river-cooled waters, but these communities also had other characteristics as well. You can think about different ways of explaining why we choose one site over the other. How would a bureaucrat or technocrat or a TEPCO choose one city versus another city? I've got different theories here, but at the end of the time, our analysis showed very clearly that those communities in Japan that had weakened or weakening civil society were the communities where Japanese authorities, that is to say, the government at the time, MITI, working with these private utilities, placed these nuclear power plants. So from the very beginning, the Japanese government has relied on weakening peripheral, poor, depopulating communities as the hosts for the fleet of 54 reactors. So that's the first thing I would argue. To the degree we actually can predict, because of course there were a number of negative reactions to attempts to build nuclear power, we actually can show in communities where they tried to build nuclear power plants and they failed, and we have around 60 or so of those attempts. Those were all in communities where civil society groups, unions, local chonaikai, horizontal associations, and so forth were stronger than other communities. So first argument I would make is that nuclear power in Japan has rested on weak civil society. The other aspect I would point out tonight, as we're talking about nuclear power 10 years after Fukushima, is that rather than seeing public opinion as a guide for public policy, the Japanese government has tried to use public opinion to be guided by public policy. So this is one example I'd like to give. What are these Japanese bureaucrats doing in California? This was in the 1980s. They're wearing their suits in a hot California day. And of course, the answer is that the Japanese government has set aside a subsidy for a number of attempts to persuade communities, local decision makers, mayors, farmers, and women to accept these nuclear power plants. So this is one project where they would actually bring community members and mayors from potential host communities around the world, including California, to see other communities that already had nuclear power. So these are kind of junkets, as we'd say in English, right? A free trip to show you what's going on and to habituate you to the idea that, look, other communities around the world and in Japan have successfully hosted these kind of nuclear power plants. So that's one thing that they did. The Japanese government also was quite successful in sending out supposedly objective scientists to give lectures, especially in these peripheral communities. And this is one of the examples that I caught. At these kind of moments, these scientists would say they're objective third parties. In most cases, though, of course, they worked for the central government. And their message was that for Japan to meet the Kyoto Protocol and other obligations, nuclear power was the only way forward, which was a good idea, of course, because it was safe without any accidents. This was until, until Tokamura, until Manchu, and until then Fukushima. But in any case, that was the argument that they made. And further, for communities, including if you can read Japanese, you see Tohoku here at the top, for communities that were hosting nuclear power plants, the Japanese government wanted to ensure that they would feel that they were welcomed and supported. So they have an annual fair held outside Tokyo where only communities that are nuclear power plant host communities, for example, Futaba, Hokkaido's Tomari, Kashiwaki Kariwaza, other communities, they would send their goods and services. So farmers and fishermen who worried maybe they wouldn't be able to sell their goods again, the Japanese government guaranteed them a market every year since the 1970s. So first set of arguments I would make would be the Japanese government has relied heavily on weak civil society and tried to guide it. I want to just follow up on Dr. Stornell's points about mental health especially, and just point out that after the 145,000 people evacuated between Naraha in the south and Itate in the north, we were able to measure in our lab the PTSD, anxiety, and mental distress scores of members of Futaba community, which is of course the closest of these three, Ishinomaki and Yamada. And the bottom line from our measurements is that those communities that had the exposure to radiation and the forced several evacuations had far higher levels of PTSD and mental anxiety than other Japanese residents going through the earthquake and the tsunami. So already high stress levels as a comparison, as you can see here, Futaba, half or more of our respondents had the highest level measurables of stress. And we also thought, for example, in trying to reduce those stress levels among those Futaba residents, that things like income and health might be factors that would reduce them. In fact, that was not the case. Neither income nor health made a difference. The only thing that made a difference actually were the social networks that they had gone through the disaster with, if they had neighbors and friends nearby that they had met over time. And I just want to wrap up with two last arguments. I've seen several pieces recently published, especially by the IAEA and other organizations, arguing that there are no measurable consequences from the Fukushima accident. I've seen this now tweeted several times just the last hour. That's clearly false. The simple reality is that the vast majority of consequences are simply social, for example, not necessarily surfacing right now in things like thyroid cancer, for example. And if you've followed at all what's been going on, we know several things have happened. First of all, divorce rates among communities in Fukushima have spiked over the past decade. Again, far higher than other communities that have faced disaster, but not faced the nuclear power meltdown. So divorce rates are up. We also know, as it's pointed out, that PTSD and anxiety are much higher among communities that lived near Fukushima. We also know that things like obesity, for example, and diabetes, the consequences of having to stay indoors after the Fukushima have also spiked. So again, and these are clearly measurable consequences. They're simply more social than physical. My last argument tonight would be the following. There's a tremendous ironic tragedy here going on in Fukushima. While a number of Fukushima groups, including the prefectural government, are pushing for renewable energy right now, and there's a lot of attempts, for example, to build offshore wind, onshore solar, and so forth, the simple reality is because decontamination and decommissioning will take at least another 40 to 50 years from right now, the core industry in Fukushima, despite attempts to push out the industry, will remain nuclear power for the next 2 generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for fascinating findings. Very, very powerful. So I'm proposing for those who can that we extend our event by 15 minutes to give full time now to Matteo Sensei and a bit of discussion. So I'm now going to turn over. So if we can stop sharing Daniel's screen, I'm going to turn over to the last to Matteo Makiko-san.
Thank you. May I share my slide, Daniel-san?
Yeah, we still see Daniel. Oh, good. Yeah, okay. Now you
so
should be able to
I'm going to share
my
slide. And so thank you. It's an honor and privilege to be here. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to reflect on this important issue. Today, I would like to share with you some of the lessons learned from Fukushima from the risk governance perspective. And after Fukushima, there was academic groups that was formed to investigate in the issues that was posed by Fukushima. And I have picked on the issue of food safety, radionuclide in food. And I also looked into the standard setting process of radionuclide in food. And I'd like to raise 4 points today here. And this is drawn from the book that we have published, edited by Shiroyama Sensei. And so the first point that I want to raise here is that risk entails uncertainty and interpretation. So although we know that the risk is a gray concept, not binary, so we cannot say black and white, but this very fact is not shared among the public at large and also the politicians. So they expect this clear-cut answer to speak, then ask the experts to speak in one voice. Whether the food is safe or not, whether the risk is zero or not. This further complicated by the fact that many disciplines existed as to the radiation and radionuclides. However, there were no expert who has expertise in both radiation and food safety at the time when the accident occurred. So I'm not going into detail because it's for the time's sake, but what I found interesting when I was talking with the experts in different disciplines that is related to radiation, radionuclide, and also talking with the food people, the perceived risks seem to be different among the different disciplines. And this was observed not within the food community, but also Shiroyama Sensei did another study. This was also seen in other community as well. So the perceived difference of the risk among the different disciplines added to the variation in a way how the risk is communicated that also added to the confusion of the public at the time. The second point that I want to raise here is that whether the risk management under crisis is different from that under the normal condition. So this is also true in terms of COVID-19 situation. In emergency, situation keeps changing and changing. So under these circumstances, should how safe is safe enough question or the safety level make adjustment to the crisis? In other words, should we fix to the safety level, or should we more allow the flexibility in looking at the safety? So in the process of the standard setting of the risk of radionuclides in food, the stark difference of the management paradigm between Ministry of Education and Ministry of Health became evident. On the one hand, Ministry of Education, who was familiar with the who is in charge of radiation hazard protection, and also familiar with the way how the with the emergency situation, they consider that the standards should be phase-based, so should respond to the situation and allow flexibility. The standards should be a reference, and also when setting up a standard, you should also take into account the other factors like the local impact, not only the food safety, but also the other economic, social factors as well. On the other hand, Ministry of Health, who is in charge of food risk and are not really accustomed to this such an emergency situation, they consider that the food safety standards should be developed solely from the health impact. And so they did not allow any excess for the if the food exists, then they said that it would be not allowed to put it on the market. So here there is a different paradigm when under the crisis, it's a thing that cannot be drawn from scientific argument. It's rather a management issue, whether to take which approach. And there is no answer to it, but I think it's worth looking into to consider the role of standard under the crisis. And the third point that I want to raise here is that about the risk governance deficit, the coordination issue, lack of coordination issue. So food standards was set by the Ministry of Health, but it only addressed the food safety risk. But the ideal way is, as is pointed by the WHO's report, identify all the pathways, all the exposure, total exposure pathways, not only the ingestion pathway from food, but also external exposure, including atmosphere, land, and so forth, and also in terms of internal exposure, inhalation. And so you need to identify all the total exposure in the first place and divided them into each exposure. However, at the time when the accident occurred, there were no or less institutional coordination among the authorities of each exposures. So such institutional arrangement has to be considered. Finally, this is also something that I'm very much interested in, but we tend to forget lessons learned quickly. So I want to ask the panelists here, or including the panelists in previous session as well, how not to forget the lessons learned and prepare for the future. How can we institutionalize the learning mechanism? As Suzuki Tatsu sensei said that thinking the unthinkable or unexpected or something that beyond imagination is important, but in fact, even the thinkable cannot be implemented. So how do we, institutional learning mechanism is something that I'm very much interested in. And such question is also relevant, I think, in seeing the COVID-19 situation in other complex risk crisis. So thank you.
Thank you, Makiko-san, for very, very good questions and great argument. In fact, we could start by putting to the panel the last question that you had. See if a couple of people may want to take it. How could we institutionalize learning mechanisms to be able to be more holistic, more reactive, more prepared, etc., to have more meta governance? So I wonder if anyone on the panel, or even the first panel, would like to grapple with that question. This is the big question emerging here. All right, Suzuki Sensei first, and then Daniel.
Right. Well, thank you very much. This is exactly why we launched this 10 years after Fukushima investigation. We need to do the periodic review of what we have done, what we have learned, and what we have not learned, and make sure that I think this is the responsibility of the civil society and academics to make sure that these are the lessons that we learned, and then these are the implemented lessons, and these are not. So this is one of the points that I like to make, that there are a number of issues which are implemented, but there are so many things untouched or left alone. So I don't think that the institutionalization or legalization of these things does not really bring that lessons effective. I think it is the constant reminder of what we have learned is the most important thing.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think there are two levels of learning, right? One is a political level where we have political will and motivation, and one is technocratic learning. So NASA learning after a disaster is quite different than will the government invest again in NASA as a resource, right? Or in this case, I think the government of Japan long ago made up its mind that nuclear energy was going to be a core part of its energy production, whatever accidents have happened. This is not the first accident, right? We had Tokaimura, which was on the death of members of the nuclear plant there, of the reprocessing process during a criticality accident. We had an accident in Mutsu, in Monju, my apologies, Asamutsu, which is the ship, but Monju, the fast breeder reactor. Again, no consequences for the nuclear industry. We've had no successes at Rokasho despite billions of dollars. The Japanese government, I don't think, wants to learn from these. There's a political will to invest in nuclear energy. And as long as that will is there, we can learn as many technocratic lessons as we want, publish as many books as we want. It's not going to change the nuclear focus and the industry that is formed, right, with LDP members, bureaucrats, and TEPCO members, right, circulating back and forth. So I think there's two different levels here. One is a political learning, which I think is not going to happen. There's a strong commitment to nuclear power, regardless of accidents. The other side is the technocratic. Will TEPCO, for example, put its next diesel power generators and batteries on the roof? Yes, they will probably do that.
Very interesting point. No one else in the panel. So, okay, so then I'll take the first question that got the most upvotes. It's actually a question for Professor McFarlane about Canada, about the point you made for the need for an independent nuclear reactor. And what is the situation in Canada, where the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission reports to the Minister of Natural Resources, which has a mandate to work with and support the need of industry and to promote nuclear energy, which is reminiscent of the Japanese situation before 2011. So, and then she mentioned the OECD NEA survey, but what can we do except, beyond filling surveys to address this?
I am going to decline to answer this question because I'm afraid I don't know enough about the Canadian regulatory situation to speak knowledgeably on this. But certainly, I think in speaking in general, this is, if you are dealing with a democracy, this is something that can be put forward by the public. I mean, you can work through your democracy to demand more oversight and to demand independent regulation. And, the nuclear industry is not the only industry that is regulated in a society and hopefully independently regulated, but hopefully there are many others. In the United States, we have many independent regulatory agencies, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission. There are quite a few of them. So it's an issue for many industries.
Thank you, Alison. So next is the question by Annelise Llewellyn. And I think Danielle will be able to take it first, but others as well. It's regarding two small towns in Hokkaido that have volunteered to host Japan's high-level nuclear waste storage facility, Kamoe Naemura and Sutsu Town, both located near active seismic zones, fault lines, but both very attracted by the large economic packages in exchange for volunteering the place for waste. So how can you deal with those situations? How can you avoid sacrificing rural communities without finding a high-risk situation of that sort? Mm-hmm.
The Japanese nuclear power industry has used tens of millions of dollars a year per city in incentives for the Dengen Sanpo since the 1970s. And that process of giving an economic lifeline to struggling, depopulating, graying areas with no industry has precisely been how they've found successful places for these sightings, and why those communities in Hokkaido, again, which are depopulating, poor, graying, and have no local industries, are volunteering for this. Or Futaba, which has already been sacrificed to the nuclear industry, right, is now being made into the new site for waste from the nuclear industry that it gave over the last 35 years of its time. So I think there's really no change that's going to happen. You do see some mayors now saying no to this kind of idea of becoming sacrifice zones for the industry. And NUMO, the overall industry, is suffering in an attempt to find a high-level regulatory waste system. But again, money, as we say in Japanese, okane wa kaiketsu. Money has been the solution for so long. I don't think there's another way forward.
Just like briefly,
yeah.
that I don't think Japan is in any way exceptional. This is exactly what's happening in Canada. So the Nuclear Waste Management Organization went through an elaborate process where they kind of said there are various ethical principles they're going to follow. But when it actually came to finding a site, this is exactly what they do. They go to these depopulating zones and say, we have $1 billion investment that we are planning for your place. Would you like to host it?
Can I just give another view on this, just, so that we have multiple views on this panel? And that is that certainly it's an issue if a community is being moved solely by, money. And so we don't like this idea of bribery, but that's not always the case. So the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, which is the only operating deep geologic repository for nuclear waste in the world, is in southeastern New Mexico. That community is very supportive of this facility. They have seen their community change, in their view, for the better because of this facility. They have seen a lot of money come into the community, not, they weren't sort of bought off by big government grants at all. They wanted this, in part, they ended up with more white collar jobs. They ended up with their children staying around because there were opportunities in the future. The education improved a lot. Money was poured into the schools. And so they have seen, they have had a positive experience. Certainly not 100% of the community is behind this facility, but the majority is. And that makes a difference. You will never find unanimity in citing anything. So you must look for consensus. That is not unanimity. But if a community sees value in doing something like this, who am I to say that they're wrong? So the community in Sweden, where the nuclear waste facility is going to be sited, they feel like they are making a contribution to society. We can't say that's wrong. So for some communities, I think this is fine, and we shouldn't be questioning them.
I just want to say, as a former resident of the Hokkaido, I agree that if there isn't a consensus, but the decision made in both Kamui Naimura and Sutsucho were basically more or less a single-handed decision by the mayors, and not backed by the public. So that has been a problem. And there were a number of occasions to explain the decision to the public after the decision was made, and that was not hugely popular. And the other thing is that there are 3 steps for the NUMO to provide the opportunities for the local municipalities to participate in this study. And this is the first step. And this is only for this the research, basically sort of a archaeology. It's not archaeological. It's a archive research. So the mayors consider that this is okay to do only a research to whether this is a suitable place or not. And they think that they have the sort of some emergency brake in the second and third step. But that is, again, difficult when they are, well, let's say, bribed. And so that has been a problem. So again, the communication between the mayor and the public is not exactly happening in these 2 cases.
2-second question here as well. Several things. One is there's a great book by Greg McAvoy called Technocracy, where he points out that precisely when citizens aren't consulted in any kind of referendum, we can call it consensual afterwards because the mayor or the town council invited the process in. That's not consensual. That's how we ended up with environmental racism. We ended up with the concentration of unwanted industrial sites across communities of color, precisely by the argument that who am I to stop them? We have to recognize equity is a critical issue in these kind of questions. Who ends up with these sites in their backyard should be the decision of a mayor. There should be a democratic process. There was none in New Mexico. And if you know right now what's actually going on, you would admit there are a number of lawsuits ongoing, both from members of the community itself who have questioned the new projects for expansion and from the Democratic senators as well, who said it was a legal process that put it there. So it's nice to process this as some kind of overall positive process. That's not the case if you look closely at the politics and the money involved.
So I don't know if Alison wishes to respond to that or move to the next question.
And we don't have to debate all of this here, but I think that the New Mexico situation is complicated. And yes, there was, as far as I know, I don't know for sure that there wasn't a vote held by the community on this, and it's a good point to say that should be part of the process if the overall community decides that should be part of the process. In Sweden, there was. And in Sweden, if you look at poll numbers, 80% of the community supports the facility. You can't deny that.
Right, so those are powerful questions. I have seen 2 extreme cases in my own travels. First, where I grew up in France, the Hague, the biggest, one of the biggest retreatment center and of course deposit place for waste, hasn't been massively protested in France. Well, at least we were taught that way in school when I grew up in France. We got to visit different plants, and then on the other side, one of the most extreme case of what Daniel described is in Taiwan, the Lanyu Island, a completely indigenous island where secretly, without telling the indigenous people, the Kuomintang government placed nuclear waste that people had no knowledge about, and it was a gorgeous, pristine island. So we see all kinds of things. Maybe for the final question, my colleague David Hengington here has raised the question of Soteigai, that is the exceptional tsunami and earthquake. The 9.0 earthquake that did occur was the largest recorded in Japan, in hundreds. So it's the 1 in 1,000 year or the 1 in 2,000 year event. How could those extremely low probability and high impact events be planned for? And the planning that was done by by TEPCO was up to 7.7 earthquake. And they thought there was a 10% probability with their 2009 data. But that would have been 30 times less energy and a much smaller tsunami. So there is that question, right? The extreme event, the extremely unlikely event. How do you deal with that?
That's always the question, which is the low probability, high consequence events. And I mean, I think if you're being honest about nuclear power and you put a nuclear reactor in a place where you have seismic potential and it's that high, then onus is probably on you to plan for that event. Or, I mean, if society says that it's okay not to, that everybody's willing to take the risk that it doesn't happen.
Right. So
that also involves honesty in admitting that such accidents can happen. And that I think is often missing. That's the problem.
Right. So we are reaching the conclusion. If anyone in the panel wants to make 30 seconds concluding statement, welcome. Otherwise, I have a final quote from former Prime Minister Kan Naoto, which I thought I should leave everybody with. It's in his book, 2017 book, Big Picture Conclusion. While we continue to make scientific and technological progress, the abilities of the individual have not evolved a great deal. And as long as this gap exists, there will be occasions when we lose control of science and technology. The development of nuclear weapons is one such paradox, a self-contradiction that could be likened to a mouse building a mousetrap. So is that a situation like this that we're talking about? Former Prime Minister Kan Naoto. And with such words, I would like to thank very much all the participants and the audience for a fabulous event that took us across a large territory of disciplines and perspectives. And that was very, very stimulating indeed. I hope we will have more in the future. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
pleasure talking to everybody.
Yeah.
Bye. It's in your cake.